I found the napkin folded into the spine of an old cookbook, one of those community press things with scorch marks along the edges and scribbled recipes in the margins. It was late afternoon. The kitchen light made the paper look softer than it was. When I unfolded it, the handwriting was small, hurried, and oddly neat, as if whoever wrote it had to make every letter count. There were 3 lines. Look under the false bottom. It's not what it seems. Tell Claire, no one knows. There was a grease stain at the corner, a faint lipstick smudge along the fold, and a single dried coffee ring. I could have laughed and put it back. I could have told myself it was an old family joke, Claire being an eccentric aunt who liked riddles. Instead, I sat down at the table with the cookbook against my chest and tried to remember the last time my aunt had actually told me a secret. For as long as I can remember, Aunt Claire wore her life like an old coat, comfortable, patched, and always a size too generous for anyone to think it was hers by vanity. She was the woman who baked pies for the block bake sale, who always said no when family suggested she deserve a holiday, who filled every role except the one the town assumed she wanted: partner, companion, someone to lean on. She never married, or at least that's what everyone said. The napkin didn't make sense at first. Why would there be instructions that didn't sound like a recipe in a cookbook we'd had since before I was born? Why would someone tell me to tell Claire that no one knows? It felt like a secret wrapped in a secret, like a gesture designed to be discovered by the right eyes in the densest possible way. When my father called that night, I almost didn't tell him about the napkin. Little fissures had always kept our family from being a single story. My mother, pragmatic and blunt. My father, the man who read the paper with his lips moving. My siblings, busy and distracted. We had our version of Claire, generous, a little lonely, the one who postponed her own needs so the rest of us wouldn't have to. That version never asked for discussion. It simply existed. Keep it, Dad said without hesitation when I told him. Whatever it is, it's hers. Don't make waves. That was our family's reflex. Protect first, question later. For decades, that reflex had looked like loyalty. It had also looked like silence. Stay with me. This changes everything. I know how that sounds, like one of those lines people use to pull listeners in online, but there was a reason I wanted you to stay. The napkin was only the smallest part of a much larger map. It was the start of a trail that led from a greasy diner table to a file folder with the word trust smeared on the corner, to a person I would not have expected to risk everything to help us. Claire's public biography was short and tidy. She lived in the same 2-bedroom house on Sycamore for 27 years.
She worked as a librarian, then as a part-time archivist for the local historical society. She kept her finances modest, gave quietly, and spent Sundays visiting our grandmother until the day Grandma died. Family lore held 2 supposedly immutable things about her. She had meant to marry once and chose not to, and she had always put our family first. People came to her for favors and leave with homemade jam and an unasked-for lecture on thrift. I loved her for those lectures. So did half the block. What nobody ever said out loud was why she moved so quickly whenever any conversation touched on her personal life. People would joke that she was shy, or that she simply liked her independence. My cousin Nina used to call her an old romantic with a wry smile, because Claire could be quietly sentimental about ordinary things, the way light hits a stack of yellowed postcards, the first bite of a warm apple pie. Even so, there was distance. A family member would bring up a photograph, and Claire's eyes would flick away, like she had learned the art of not letting the camera hold her. Except the napkin suggested that the distance had a shape to it, an intentionality that somehow weighed more than the casual stories we told ourselves at holidays. It implied a plan, or a protection, or at least the possibility of one. Once you realize that someone may have been shaping your family's story from the inside out, the urge to understand becomes a quiet obsession. I started with small things, old photos from Claire's albums, a summer picnic dated July 2004, a candid snapshot of her laughing with a man at the edge of the frame, his face turned towards her in a way that suggested more than friendship. No caption. On the back, a splotch of ink where someone had started to write and then stopped. Receipts folded into the seams of bookmarks, a hotel from a weekend in a neighboring city, a plane ticket stub with a destination scratched out. Little halves of lives.
But the real momentum came from a stranger who had no reason to be compassionate to us. I met her in the kind of diner that keeps its vinyl seats warm by accident. Too bright at noon, small squares of laminated menus, coffee that tastes like the same pot since the 70s. I had gone because my grandmother's cookbook led me to every cafe, every bodega, every volunteer to whom Claire had once lent a book. I was searching for patterns in the mundane. I was half listening to the clatter of plates when the waitress put a cup of coffee down in front of me without being asked. She was a woman in her late 20s, hair tied back with a faded bandana, eyes that moved like they had cataloged trouble. She said my name before I told her it, like some small oracle of the lunch crowd. "You, Maya?" she asked. Her voice had that cautious edge you hear when people calculate whether they'll be safe if they speak. "Yes," I said. She slid onto the booth beside me as if she had no fear of being scolded.
"My name's Lena," she said. "I used to work at the Portside Diner. That napkin, did you find it in Claire's cookbook?" My mouth went dry. I hadn't told anyone about the napkin because for a while I didn't know whether it was confession or a riddle. The fact that Lena knew meant there were more hands in this than I had imagined. "How," I began. Lena took the coffee and turned it in her hands, watching steam like it was a compass. "You don't know me, but I know you. Claire used to come in sometimes, sat in the corner, and she always left a tip on a napkin." She smiled, not a welcoming smile, but a tired one. She used to give us napkins with numbers or names, little things. She did it quietly. One night she slipped me one and told me, "If anything ever goes wrong, take it to this number." Didn't expect to have to, but sometimes people get in over their heads. A part of me had imagined a soap opera where Claire was the tragic figure hiding a scandal. What I had not expected was this: the napkin as a deliberate breadcrumb she had been leaving for someone she trusted in the world, someone with no stake in the family name, someone who could act without being constrained by our family's reflex to protect. Lena's face was unremarkable in a way that made it sharp. You could tell she had seen pain in people and learned to keep her hands clean. She told me quietly that she had seen patterns in the diner. Men who came to the back booth late at night, men who left with files or envelopes. One man had been particularly careful. Sleeve cuffs always buttoned, checked the door before he spoke, left behind a receipt with a hotel's name. He never saw Claire's face from the booth. He saw what he wanted to see: a woman alone, a name that could be bought, a ledger waiting to be drawn into. The whistleblower in our story did not look heroic when she described this. She looked like someone who had once watched her own father get ruined, who knew the acuteness of small violences. A lie repeated, a loan that never stops being a loan, a rumor turned into a legal threat. "My dad lost everything because he trusted the wrong person," she said, and the weight of that sentence made the clatter of forks feel obscene. I couldn't watch it happen again. She had risked her job to keep a napkin folded in her apron, a napkin Claire had slipped her in the time between years and bills. People called such acts foolish because they imagined bold cinematic gestures. Lena's version was quieter. A napkin, a memory, a matter of conscience. She told me that when she found out Claire was connected to something, someone, she kept an eye. She took a picture of an envelope left at the back booth. She remembered names and dates. When Claire stopped coming as often, Lena found herself wondering whether the woman had been silenced or had chosen to step back. Because Lena had suffered through watching trust be weaponized, she could not stand still. "You have to understand," Lena said, her voice low. "I didn't go to the police at first. I wasn't sure. But when I saw the pattern, transfers, keys exchanged with a man who was not family, I knew someone was taking advantage. Not of Claire, of the people she cared about. I can't explain it cleanly. I just knew I couldn't look away." The evidence Lena produced wasn't cinematic either. It was a photo of an envelope, the way a phone camera makes everything immediate, date stamp in the corner, a small smear of ink, a handwritten note on the back that read, "For sorrow account, keep safe." A screenshot of a text conversation with the number saved under the name T. Reed. The name matched the partial name on an old receipt I had found. Lena handed me a faded napkin too, one with a corner torn off. "She told me once," Lena said, "that if most people knew what Claire had done for us, they'd change their minds about her loneliness. I didn't know what that meant. I thought it was a quirk. I was wrong." I remember feeling both grateful and sick. Grateful because someone had finally acknowledged a piece of Claire's invisible labor. Sick because the acknowledgement implied a cost Claire had borne alone.
That night, I went home and pulled every little thing Claire had ever given me out of drawers: a small key with no label, a receipt for a storage locker I'd never been told about, an envelope with the word trust penciled on the outside. Each object suddenly felt like a hinge. I called a lawyer the next morning. I didn't know how to find the right one, someone who would understand family secrets without wanting to turn them into stories for television. My cousin Nina suggested a name, Amelia Park, who had a reputation for being the kind of lawyer who didn't just talk, she acted. Amelia had once represented a teacher in a complicated estate case that ended quietly but fairly. The press hadn't loved it because Amelia did not court publicity. That was the sort of discretion we needed. When I walked into Amelia's office, there was a photograph of her standing on a courthouse step with an elderly woman, laughing like the two of them had survived something big. Amelia looked up from a mountain of files and offered me tea. Her hands were steady. Her voice fell into place like a hinge. "You say you have evidence?" she asked. There was no surprise in her tone, just a readiness that I found oddly comforting. I set the napkin, Lena's photos, the storage receipt, and Claire's key on her desk. Amelia flipped through things with the calm speed of someone who had done this before. Identify, catalog, determine plausibility. "First step," she said, "is to figure out what we have that is documentary and what is inference. Documents matter in court. So do witnesses." She explained things in a way that made them feel less like instruments and more like tools you could hold safely.
A forensic audit, she said, is a deep dive into transactions, where money moved, who signed what, which accounts match which transfers. An injunction, she paused, anticipating my blank look, is a court order to stop someone from moving assets. If we can show a credible threat that money will be removed or hidden, a judge might grant an emergency freeze while the audit runs. But you don't get these things by shouting. You get them with credible documentation, credible witnesses, and a timeline. "What about Claire?" I asked. "Will this hurt her? People already think she's fragile. I don't want to make her a punchline." Amelia nodded. She folded her hands. "That's why we proceed carefully. There may be a reason Claire kept her distance that is protective rather than shameful. But right now we have a choice. Ignore a string of anomalies and hope for the best, or follow them until we know. Following them might upset people. It might also protect people. My job is to ensure the law protects, not persecutes." She recommended bringing in a forensic investigator, an accountant who specialized in tracing funds and flagging irregularities. Simon Hale was the name she gave me. He smelled faintly of coffee and wore shoes that looked like he'd walked a lot. He liked ledgers the way some people like music, and he spoke in a rhythm that made numbers feel like a language rather than a threat. Simon took the receipts and photos and blinked at them like someone trying a new instrument. "Give me time," he said simply. "A few days. I'll map transfers, cross-check dates, and see whether there's a pattern that suggests someone funneled funds through intermediaries." He warned me about assumptions. What looks like theft can sometimes be a legitimate transfer. Loans, reimbursements, trusts, it's all timing and context. But patterns don't lie. They lie in ways that are consistent. Within 48 hours, Simon sent a short email with subject line, "Prelim Findings." There was a PDF attached with red highlights that looked like surgical marks. That night I printed the pages and laid them next to the napkin on my kitchen table. The red highlights showed 3 transfers over a 2-year period from an account associated with a small consulting firm to an account that, on paper, was registered under a trust with the name R. Hartwell attached. R. Hartwell was not a name any of us recognized. The transfers were modest enough to be dignified, but repetitive and timed in ways that suggested a rhythm. Right after payroll week, right before property taxes were due. There were names in the memo fields that matched partial references in Claire's notes. Simon called it cautious. Money moved like someone testing how far they could push without triggering alarms. He also pointed at one line that my throat closed. A wire sent to an offshore entity 2 towns away from where the man Lena had photographed had listed his office. The sum was larger, and the memo was blank. Amelia asked for everything. Lena's photos, the napkin, Claire's key, the storage receipt, the hotel's torn ticket stub. She put them into a manila folder labeled with my last name in her precise hand. "We have to build credibility," she said. 2 things make a judge listen: corroboration and risk. Corroboration comes from witnesses like Lena and documents like these. Risk comes from demonstrated movement of assets. We filed the paperwork for an emergency motion the next morning. The motion asked the court for two things: a temporary restraining order, freezing transfers from certain accounts tied to people of interest, and permission to subpoena bank records tied to the trust names and the offshore entity for a limited period. Amelia explained that a judge would evaluate whether there was an immediate risk of dissipation of assets. Evidence that money had moved offshore or been layered through intermediaries could be compelling. There was an odd intimacy in watching the motions take shape. Legal language, for all its sterility, looked like armor when you saw it assembled with care. Every phrase mattered. Every document attached to those motions had to be authentic. Amelia made copies of Lena's photos and had her sign a sworn statement. "Whistleblowers are vulnerable," she said strictly. "We have to protect her identity to the extent the law allows." Lena trembled when she signed the affidavit. She told Amelia in the hallway, in a quick rush, how her father had lost his small contracting business, how a line of dishonest promises had become a debt she could not pay. "I kept thinking," Lena said, voice low, "if someone else has to watch it happen, I'd rather it be me than a family." I watched Lena and felt gratitude and a new, awful guilt. No one asks for this kind of burden when they're 27 and trying to keep the rent paid. Amelia filed the motion with the clerk's office, and we waited. The wait felt like standing at a crosswalk, watching the little red man count down. We all knew what could happen if the court denied the motion. Funds could move, documents could disappear into the kind of fog that makes things unrecoverable. We also knew that a granted motion would bring scrutiny into a family that had managed quietness as a protective strategy. While we waited, I went through Claire's journals, small notebooks she wrote in with meticulous care. They were the parts of her life she had been willing to put in ink, the places where she let herself be literal. There, among a recipe for lemon curd and a margin note about the lecture she gave at the Historical Society, I found a folded letter addressed to me. It read, simply, "If you find this, it means I trusted you enough to let the truth out. I did what I thought would protect you. Whether that was right, I do not know." There were more lines, tangents about guilt and duty, and an apology so raw I could feel the paper doing the crying for her. She admitted to arrangements I half expected and half feared. Loans guaranteed in her name. Small properties bought and held in odd trust names. A storage locker with boxes labeled only by numbers. There were entries about late-night phone calls and someone who could make a rumor into leverage. The letter did not give me a clean narrative of villain and victim. It gave me a map of choices that read like reckonings. She had been offered an arrangement that would, in effect, make her responsible on paper for complicated financial movements so the people she loved could stay safe publicly. In certain entries, she wrote about being the scapegoat on purpose, taking blame so that a child or aging parent would not be pulled under by legal threat or blackmail. In others, she confessed that she had not known everything and had been surprised by greed's angles. I called her that evening, hands shaking. She answered on the second ring, a small, dry sound like someone who had been waiting for decades to be needed. Her voice was the same voice I had loved, the one that read poetry aloud at family dinners as if the words were handpicked. "You found things," she said. There was no anger in her. There was only the tiredness of someone who had been carrying a season's worth of bad weather. "I found the napkin," I said, "and letters, and things." There was a silence long enough for the radio in the background to play a whole song. "You did right," she said finally. "You always did." There was an ache in that sentence that felt like a ledger in itself, debts and credits of love. "I didn't want to make waves," I said. "Dad told me not to." "Your father always wants to fix everything with a kind silence," Claire interrupted gently. "But silence is not a solution if something is being taken from others. I didn't tell you because I wasn't ready to watch you worry, and because I thought I could manage it. It's cowardice sometimes. It's also sometimes strategy." "Strategy to what?" I asked. "To keep the ones who couldn't take a hit from being hit," she answered. "To keep your brother from losing his home. To keep your mother from being humiliated in public. To keep you from being dragged into arguments about money when what you needed was a normal life. I took those things because I thought I was protecting you. Whether that made me noble or foolish, I don't know." She asked about Lena and the photos and whether I had taken the right steps. I told her we had filed for an injunction and were waiting on a hearing. For the first time in years, my aunt made a sound I had never heard her make, a tiny, surprised laugh. "Oh," she said. "So finally, the law steps in. It is time." It was hard for me to reconcile this Claire, strategic, resigned, self-sacrificing, with the woman who had been both fiercely private and generously maternal. That duality, That ability to fold herself into the safety of others seemed like both tenderness and a kind of violence, a giving so complete it erased her own small joys. The more I dug, the more it looked like she had been negotiating her happiness away in the currency of other people's stability. At the same time, the document Simon flagged suggested an uglier story about the other players. The man Lena photographed, Thomas Reed, as the receipts slowly revealed, had business affiliations, a careful public face, and an array of shell companies that made money move like smoke. He was not, per se, a criminal in any public sense we could point to, without stepping over the boundary between allegation and proven fact. He was, however, practiced in opacity, which is the lawyer's least favorite tool, because it's the tool of plausible deniability. Opacity is not evidence of guilt, Amelia had told me over the phone, her voice clipped with that professional caution that keeps people from making premature headlines. But it is a risk factor. Judges don't like to freeze assets without the smell of urgency. We need to demonstrate immediate risk and credible linkage. We began to build that linkage. The napkin had been the smallest, most human key. Lena's photos and her sworn affidavit were witness and heart. Claire's letters were motive and context. Simon's ledgers were the map of movement. Amelia's motions were the tools. The night before the judge was to hear the emergency motion, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too loud with thoughts. I went back through the notebooks and found a page where Claire had sketched a list of things to hold for safekeeping. A set of keys, a small box of letters, a storage unit number. Next to one item she'd scrawled, "If all else fails, use the napkin." The phrase felt almost absurd until you realized the napkin was not so absurd. It was a craftily obvious odd thing in an obvious place. The hearing itself was a bureaucratic pressure cooker. We sat in rows behind the lawyers while the judge, a woman with silver hair and a soft voice, glanced at the filings and at the counsel who spoke. Amelia argued for the temporary freeze with a quiet ferocity. She showed the judge the pattern: repeated transfers timed around personal tax deadlines, an offshore wire that suggested an attempt to move funds quickly, and the credible witness who had documented envelopes exchanged in the back booth of a diner. She framed it as an instance where inaction would create harm that couldn't be unscrambled. The judge listened. To be clear, the judge did not pronounce Thomas Reed guilty of anything. No grand verdict was delivered, but the judge nodded at the risk and granted a temporary freeze on the accounts specifically identified in the motion, on the narrow grounds that funds were at real risk of being removed during the pendency of an audit.
The temporary freeze, Amelia explained afterward, gave us breathing room to do the forensic work without the terror that, as Simon had put it, money would evaporate. That breathless relief was the most complicated feeling. We had not vindicated Claire's choices. We had not, in any legal sense, declared anyone malicious. We had merely created space, literal, legal breathing room for truth to be uncovered. The investigator filed his request for subpoenas. Barrage of documents came in: anonymized bank statements, account names that matched trust names that matched the little penciled codes in Claire's notebooks. There were spreadsheets with cryptic labels and memos like support arrangement or household maintenance. Some transfers were marked as loans, some were marked as reimbursements. Simon spent an entire Tuesday evening mapping relationships and drawing little arrows among entities like a cartographer of suspicion. It felt like we were assembling a puzzle where half the pieces had been chewed by someone content to hide the image. Each verified transfer was a corner found. Each corroborated date was a straight edge. The napkin had been a start. Simon's spreadsheets made it a path. But then came the thing neither of us wanted to see on paper: a list of amounts that, when summed, represented a level of burden that I had never associated with Claire. The money itself wasn't astronomical. This was not the kind of story that fills tabloids. But for the people who relied on Claire's careful choices, a sister with a crippled business, an aging parent with a dreamless pension, the amounts were life-changing. They were enough to keep a house from foreclosure, enough to cover a round of medical treatments, enough to stop a cascade of personal ruin. I sat with the spreadsheet in the dim light of my kitchen and felt like I had discovered a secret language Claire had used to talk to the world. The ledger showed small acts of mitigation: rent covered, late fees paid, tax penalties averted. The ledger also showed entries that made me angry: fees that matched consulting invoices from companies connected to Reed, deposits to accounts Claire had never listed in her will, payments that entered and left with no clear beneficiary. We were at the edge of a truth that had two faces. One face showed Claire as a guardian angel of quiet interventions. The other face suggested she had been used,
unwittingly or not, by people who were happy to translate her generosity into leverage. I remember the first time I read a line in Claire's handwriting that made me think she had suspected the second face. They told me it was temporary. They told me it was for the family's good. I believed them until belief cost more than it should. She had written that in a small spiral-bound notebook between a shopping list and a poem. The sentence sliced me because it meant she had no illusions, or at least that she had, at some point, stopped pretending not to see the trade.
By the time Simon and Amelia met with us in the small conference room of the law firm, fatigue had transformed into a focused anger that smelled of fairness and urgency. "We are not out to pillory anyone," Amelia said, opening a folder. "We are out to trace assets and establish whether Claire's sacrifices were consensual and whether they were manipulative. If Claire chose to take on burdens to protect people, that's morally complex. If someone used her choices as cover to enrich themselves, that is a legal problem. Two different things. We need to separate them." Simon spread a printout that looked like a family tree drawn with bank accounts and shell companies as branches. "There are 3 channels," he said. "One is direct transfers to named trust accounts, which match what Claire described in her notes as temporary safekeeping. The second involves third-party accounts that perform as pass-throughs. These are red flags for layering. The third is offshore routing that, for now, looks intentional." Amelia pointed to a line. "The key is the offshore routing," she said. "If funds are being pulled out of reach while we're disputing them, we will have to argue to a judge that the pattern is part of a scheme to avoid accountability. For that, we need as many touch points as possible. Witness statements, emails, copies of correspondence." "Do we have those?" I asked. Simon nodded slowly. "We have emails with partial headers, some copies of contracts with signatures blurred, and one service invoice that matches a consulting company registered to a director who's in the same circle as Reed. We'll need to subpoena servers and company records. That takes time, but the freeze gives us that." That night, I drove to Claire's house and sat on her back steps until the sky was the color of a bruise. The house smelled like the lemon oil she used on her railings and the faint perfume of something she kept in the top drawer. When she came out to sit beside me, she didn't look like someone who had been soft with loneliness. She looked like someone who had been carrying the weight of a weather report for years. "Why?" I asked, not sure if I meant the question for the legal sea we were navigating or the personal territory she had bargained away. The words split between both meanings. She took my hand in a way that suggested she had been waiting to give it up. I was afraid to let others hurt like I had seen others hurt. The cost of speaking loudly was not something I wanted truncated into other people. I thought the quiet work was less damaging. "And did it work?" I asked. "Did keeping quiet protect them?" Claire's answer was the kind that is both yes and no. "Sometimes, but I didn't account for shame becoming leverage. I thought I could manage the edges. There are things I did not foresee. There are people who turned favors into expectations. There are limits to what a single person can absorb without being eaten by it." In that conversation, she confessed to more than sentiment. She confessed to a decision, to accept burdens on paper that would deflect scrutiny from those she loved. She described counselors and whispered deals, 2 or 3 hands on forms I hadn't seen, and a counsel that had told her the arrangement was temporary. She had counted on time to be an ally. If there's one thing I learned through that first stretch, it's this. Sacrifices made for other people can become sites of theft if unscrupulous minds see consent as opportunity. Claire's sacrifice, choosing to make herself the public face of complicated financial arrangements, had a nobility to it and a danger bound to it. She had stepped into a role that required her to be available for criticism, to accept blame if the plan failed. In exchange, she believed she would buy safety for others. Only later would we know whether only later would mean restitution, or only the quiet confirmation that she had been used. For now, we were still assembling the scaffolding. The next morning, an envelope arrived at my apartments with no return address. Inside was a USB drive affixed to a napkin. Same grease stain, same hurried handwriting. There was no note, only the drive with the word Claire scratched on its plastic casing. My hands were colder holding it than they had been when I unfolded the first napkin. Amelia told me to handle the drive carefully. "Clueless curiosity can ruin a case," she said. "Let us image it in a forensically sound way."
but the urge to see what was inside felt like the pull to open a wound to know what had hurt you. I promised to wait. That promise lasted until late that night, when anxiety, like rain, breaks through willpower. I took the drive to a friend who worked at a small tech firm and asked, and he did something that was careful and small. He created a read-only image that allowed us to see contents without altering metadata. When the folder names popped up on the screen, my heart knocked against the inside of my ribs. There were documents with dates and labels: Payroll Adjust 2009, Trust Claire Holdings, Incident Report 2012, and a set of photos with timestamps that matched entries in Claire's notebooks. One photo showed Claire seated at a table, looking determined in a dim cafe, across from a man with a pocket square who was speaking as if he were making terms. Another photo showed an envelope half open with bills peeking out. There was an audio file labeled CL 2014 call, and a PDF of a printed email chain with partial redactions, and one line that stood out: "If we can keep the appearance, the family stays intact." The line felt murderous in its innocence. Keep the appearance. Keep what? Happiness? Normalcy? Or the illusion of normalcy that sells better at church suppers than the truth does in courts? I emailed the image to Amelia and Simon and went to bed with my brain rehearsing the legal choreography.
There was a grief to waiting for lawyers to speak in legal tones about the things that, in any other context, would have been personal confessions. Amelia called me 2 hours later with a cadence that suggested both progress and strain. "We can use the USB contents to support our motion to expand the subpoena," she said, "but we must be precise. We need to show chain of custody, proof that the files haven't been altered. Lena authenticated the napkins. Claire's notebooks corroborate dates. This strengthens our showing of risk, and it gives us more leverage to compel records from third parties." It felt like putting a lantern in a dark room. The lantern revealed cobwebs and the shape of furniture you'd thought you knew. But light also reveals what lives in corners and what has been hiding because the light was never turned on. That afternoon, I drove to the storage locker listed in Claire's notebook. The unit smelled like cardboard and the faint tang of old fabric. The combination on the lock had been written in tiny script in the margin of a page. When I opened the metal door, my breath left me. There were boxes labeled with dates in cryptic notes: 1978, photos, tax docs 2006 to 2010, claim devices. In the back, beneath a stack of vintage magazines, was a locked metal box, small, heavy, and unassuming. I managed to coax it open with the key Claire had accidentally given me years before when she said, "Keep this. If anything happens, it's for you." Inside the box were letters, handwritten notes, some of them addressed to Claire and some to R. Hartwell. There was a ledger with entries in pencil. There were envelopes with little slips of what looked like bank memoranda. And there, on the bottom, was a short letter written on thin paper, the penmanship someone uses when they don't want a hand to tremble. "I did this to protect you," the letter began. "I did this because I believed the cost to one life was less than the cost to many. If I am wrong, forgive me. If I am right, forgive me for being the one you blame." I read the letter 3 times and felt the ground shift under my childhood, like a room you'd thought had 4 walls, and then finding a 5th. The letter's ambiguity saved Claire in one sense. She had acted out of love and fear. It also made her choice a moral burden for the rest of us. When I walked out of the storage unit, the sun had set, and my phone buzzed with a message from Amelia. "Judge granted limited subpoenas. Prepare for discovery." It was a small line of text with enormous implication. Discovery would mean subpoenas and depositions. It meant other people's words turning into sworn statements, and the comfortable fog of family myth thinning under courtroom light. The judge's limited subpoenas arrived like a sudden invitation to look at everything at once. Over the next 3 weeks, papers arrived at our house in manila envelopes, in sealed packets, in printouts tied with rubber bands. Each one felt both like proof and like an accusation. The first tranche of bank records came with columns and codes that resisted meaning until Simon began to speak them aloud. He would sit at our dining table with a laptop like a conductor, pointing at a line and translating. "Look here," he said one evening, leaning over the printout as if it were a map. "See the memo? Maintenance? That repeats. Support arrangement. Here it is again. Then a transfer to a pass-through and a wire overseas. Patterns. someone arranging monthly relief while simultaneously moving funds through layering. "Why wouldn't the bank flag this?" I asked. It was not a naive question. I wanted institutional answers, quotas that failed, signals missed. "Timing," Simon said simply. "Smaller sums, irregular descriptors, moved through proper channels. Those things are designed to look ordinary. They're often below the threshold that triggers red flags, unless someone alerts the bank or there's a court order. We have the court order now." Amelia moved regimes of document wrangling with the precision of someone who'd learned how to think inside a giant machine. She prepared deposition notices, requests for sworn testimony, from the companies that appeared on the invoices and the men who had signed them. We served a subpoena on the consulting firm with the checked cuff and the office 2 towns over, Reed & Cole Consulting. Thomas Reed hired counsel, who at first glance resembled a person trained to keep things neat and distant. He did not answer our questions in comfortable sentences. He preferred the taut, circular language of legal counsel. Depositions are strange rituals. People sit under the formal, linear heat of questioning and try to make a story that fits both truth and self-interest. Reed's deposition was terse. He was careful with dates and fond of the phrase business practice, which Amelia translated in a tone that meant answers you in a way that keeps us legally safe. The transcript revealed little else, answers hedged, a few blank spaces where memory allegedly failed, until one of Reed's associates, a CFO named Elaine Morrow, began to talk. Elaine's statement came after someone at Reed & Cole decided cooperation was cheaper than a long fight. She testified about consulting invoices that had been recharacterized in bookkeeping to make them appear as reimbursable expenses. She admitted under oath that some transfers had been labeled ambiguously to mask directionality, an accountant's euphemism for hiding where money really ended up. She did not name Claire at first. She described a pattern, funds to be directed to third parties for operational support, which on paper sounded legitimate, but in practice were routed through trusts and shell accounts. "When did you first notice this?" Amelia asked, gentle, surgical. Elaine paused. "When auditing for a client last year, I noticed an account that did not reconcile. I traced it back to what we call support arrangements, and then to a trust whose owner, on paper, was a name not listed in the company's active ledgers. It raised red flags, so I elevated it." Elevated is a careful word. It meant she sent memos up the chain. It also meant she did what many of us don't do. She risked her job to point to an irregularity. That risk mattered. People like Lena and Elaine were those small, inconvenient edges of truth that governments and families alike depend on, but rarely thank. Site visits followed. Amelia arranged interviews with the banks and with the trust company that had opened the accounts. We learned things of a granular, grinding nature. Signatures on forms matched Claire's handwriting in places. Some account names were registered to entities that used addresses tied to one of Reed's businesses. There were emails with partial headers, some truncated, some redacted, and one chain we managed to reconstruct that included the phrase we had feared, "Keep the appearance." It was followed by an instruction to expedite a wire transfer in the name of temporary support. Still, even with this scaffolding, the central question remained. Did Claire step into these arrangements willingly, as a sacrifice, or was she manipulated into a scapegoat whose goodwill was exploited? We needed a node where motive, consent, and leverage overlapped. That node appeared in a different form than any of us had expected, in a series of voicemails Claire had saved. Claire had recorded calls in a small, old-fashioned way, on a handheld recorder she kept in her top drawer. The WAV files, transferred from the USB, were grainy and intimate. One early call featured the man with a soft, patronizing tone, telling her everything would be for the family's good, then pressing the point that certain arrangements had to be made on paper. Another call, 2 years later, contained Claire's quiet, iron steadiness as she tried to articulate limits. "I agreed to help for a season," she said in that tape, voice steady, "but you told me it would stop once obligations were met. It has never stopped." Hearing her voice in those recordings, I felt the compassionate complexity of the woman I loved and the exhausted firmness of someone who had made bargains that outlasted their original terms. It made me both proud and incandescently angry. Everything coalesced in the week the forensic audit returned its report. Simon produced a bound document with margin notes and a cover sheet that felt heavier than the pages warranted because of what those pages meant. The audit did not accuse anyone of a crime. It mapped money. It showed a flowchart of transfers that made a labyrinth look simple.
Funds labeled as support repeatedly flowed into accounts that then made pass-through transfers to third-party companies, then to personal accounts connected to people within Reed's network. It showed deposits into accounts linked to known entities controlled by Reed's associates.
It showed payments that matched dates in Claire's notebooks, her notes on rent, medical bills, and family assistance, but also payments that did not match anything in her ledger. Simon read the report to us like a teacher reading aloud from a book he wished had a different ending. What this shows, he said, is that Claire's accounts were used as stops in a network that moved money in a way that allowed someone to extract value while keeping their own hands reasonably clean. Whether that was malicious or opportunistic in every instance is something a court will have to decide. But there is enough here to argue that funds moved in a way that created substantial risk of loss for the beneficiaries Claire thought she was protecting. We filed a motion to expand the subpoenas and to convert the temporary freeze into a broader, though still targeted, preliminary injunction. Amelia argued that the network structure suggested an immediate risk of dissipation, meaning the funds could be routed out of reach before thorough accounting. Judges listen to phrases like immediate risk when they see documentary support. Simon's charts and Lena's affidavit supplied that support. The judge granted the expansion. What followed was a sequence of ordinary legal brutality. Requests for more documents, objections, privilege claims, and an energetic series of phone calls between Amelia and Reed's counsel that smelled alternately of polish and desperation. Reed's company lost a key client who did not want to be associated with a firm under subpoena. A corporate partner announced an internal review. Reed himself took a leave of absence, labeled as a personal sabbatical in a press release that read like a magic trick meant to make accountability vanish in plain sight. The day we received news that a settlement was on the table felt like sunrise through blinds, harsh, direct, and not subtly warm. Reed's counsel proposed a negotiated settlement, reimbursement of certain funds, dissolution of a specific consulting agreement, and an agreement that the named trust accounts would be restructured so that assets would be returned to the named beneficiaries under court supervision. There was also an offer to agree to reasonable oversight of the reallocated funds for a specified period. We had to decide whether to accept. Settlements, Amelia reminded us, are pragmatic. They don't declare righteousness. They prevent the long grinding of discovery that sometimes erodes the lives of those it purports to protect. A settlement would mean that money moved back into channels that could help our family, that further emotional exposure for Claire might be limited, and that the courts would oversee the distribution. It would also mean that Reed might avoid a prolonged public scrutiny that could have revealed more names and more networks.
We asked for more: protections for Claire's reputation, an agreement to publicize a corrective statement that acknowledged questionably routed funds, and an enforceable plan to return assets. We wanted consequences that did not simply compensate dollars, but addressed patterns. Reed's consulting firm would have to undergo an audit, key contracts would be reviewed by an independent monitor, and a portion of funds would be placed in a supervised escrow to pay down debts that had been stabilized by Claire's interventions. When I told Claire about the proposed settlement, she surprised me by pulling up a chair and folding the napkin she'd kept on her nightstand. "You are doing more than I could have hoped," she told me. "I don't want Reed to be destroyed. I want the money to be where it's needed. I want the lies to stop. If a settlement does that, then we take it." There's a kind of bravery in choosing the least dramatic path when it promises the truest repair. Claire's voice had always been paradoxically pragmatic and sentimental. Here, it was both. She wanted the family to be safe, not to see a private sorrow turned into a public spectacle that would harm people beyond Reed and his inner circle. We negotiated the terms for days, until the settlement looked like a contract with breathing room. Reed's firm agreed to return a portion of the funds traced to the trust accounts, to submit to an independent audit, and to make a corrective statement acknowledging the irregularities without admitting legal guilt. Reed agreed to step down from active management and to cooperate with a limited disclosure committee. The settlement also included protections for whistleblowers. Lena would receive compensation for her role and a guarantee of anonymity in any public statements. Elaine, the internal accountant, asked for protections too, and they were granted. When the agreement was signed, the relief felt anticlimactic in a way that made sense. Legal resolutions are often tidy papers rather than cinematic confessions. Money returned to accounts placed under supervision, bills were paid. A mortgage that had been breathing with worry found a steady intake again. For the people who had depended on Claire's secret balancing, the practical rescue mattered more than anything public. But the settlement did not answer everything. The moral ledger still required reconciliation. Reed's exit from his firm left ripples.
His reputation was damaged, clients left, and partners initiated reviews. There were consequences, contracts dissolved, partnerships severed, and a career that had seemed durable chipped like a stone hammered too many times. Those were natural results of a public unraveling of trust. We did not, and would not, dance in anyone's ruin. The law had provided a remedy of sorts. Our family had to provide mercy, without forgetting.
At the same time, the settlement cleared a path for something else, the chance to understand why Claire had taken on this burden in the first place. The legal scaffolding had given us authority and space to ask different questions, the personal ones. We gathered in Claire's kitchen the night the escrow was set up and the payments began to clear. The light over the table was warm, the kettle hissed, and the house felt smaller and softer. My father made coffee. Nina arrived with a batch of lemon bars. The air smelled like citrus and second chances. We did not make a show of gratitude. Instead, Claire brought out a stack of letters she had written and never sent, notes to herself and to us. She had, it turned out, written more than the one addressed to me. "I wrote to you all in pieces," she said, handing them around, "mostly so I could make sense of what I was doing without having to say it aloud and change everyone's future before I knew if my choices were right. I'm sorry for the secrecy. I'm sorry for the lies of omission. But I ask you to see why." Her letters unfolded a logic that was as tender as it was flawed. She spoke of the day she found my uncle's small business failing and the look on his face the first time a creditor came with the fast smile of someone who eats people's dignity for breakfast. She spoke about a sister who had once been publicly humiliated by a scandal and never recovered. She wrote about learning that the best laid plans sometimes demand a person who is willing to become the face that takes blame while others keep their names clean, for a while. She used the word buffer often, a human buffer between harm and those who could not bear it. There were concrete examples, rent checks she had covered, medical bills she had redirected through accounts she controlled, small property purchases she had made in trust to shield a nephew from being seized by judgments. There were also lines that read like confessions, times she had agreed to sign documents she did not fully understand, times she had believed promises that people later reneged on. "Why didn't you tell us?" I asked, more gently than I had in months. The answer was both simple and complicated. "I didn't want to," she said, folding her hands. "Not because I thought you were incapable, but because I worried about what truth would do to the people I wanted to protect. Truth is a strong medicine. It can be used to heal or to harm. I tried to be a careful apothecary. I failed sometimes." Nina, who had always regarded Claire with a complicated mixture of affection and exasperation, reached out and took her hand. "You saved us," she said, "even if it hurt you." Claire nodded. "I wasn't always sure I was saving anyone. I was sure I was trying." That evening we spoke of forgiveness not as a one-time absolution, but as a practice, an ongoing willingness to hold complexity without flattening it into heroism or blame.
We tried to name what the sacrifice cost her, sundered relationships she might have had, a love she let go because she believed public vulnerability would damage others, small career choices she had made that limited her income and independence. "I gave up a chance at love," she said, a small laugh that did not carry triumph. "Not because I had to, but because I made the arithmetic of risk in my head. I counted wrong some of the time, but I couldn't bear seeing you in financial ruin." Hearing that, I felt the shape of her sacrifice differently. It was not an act of pure nobility. It was a complicated set of choices made under pressure, mixtures of courage and fear. She had deliberately made herself the visible containment for harm. That containment had become its own kind of cage. After the settlement, life resumed with a new axis. The most obvious change was practical. Debts eased, housing security stabilized, and the immediate threat of someone emptying accounts was gone. But the subtler changes were the ones that would outlast the legal paper. Our family began to talk differently about vulnerability. My father, who had always had silence as his default form of love, began attending family dinners more often. My siblings, who had treated Claire's privacy as eccentricity, asked more questions and listened to the answers. We began to share chores in a way that made us less likely to rely on a single person as a safety valve. There were restorative gestures too. A small, community-staged thank you at the Historical Society named a bench in Claire's honor. The plaque read something modest about generosity of spirit.
Claire balked at public attention, but agreed because she knew symbolic recognition sometimes opened doors for practical help. A community fund for emergency expenses, a network for people who needed counsel. We placed some of the settlement funds into that fund under Port supervision, ensuring they would be used for the original purposes Claire had intended, to help those who could not afford a sudden catastrophe. As the months unfolded, Reed's firm continued to unravel in business terms. Clients moved away, and an independent audit found inadequacies in internal controls that required structural overhaul. Reed's name receded from press releases and board minutes. That was as much consequence as the settlement would give us without a criminal prosecution, and it was, in its own small way, accountability for a man whose opacity had become a weapon. Lena returned to our lives in a quiet way. She did not want limelight or thanks shouted across a stage. She accepted our gratitude with the wary dignity of someone who had learned sacrifice in a different register. We assisted her with a referral to a counseling service and offered help with rent while she sorted new job prospects. She preferred the unspoken solidarity to public applause. As for Elaine, the accountant, she took a new position at a firm that valued compliance.
She sent me a short note. We were taught to look away. Now I look. It was the smallest of confessions and the largest of changes. As for Claire, the settlement gave her something she had not thought she would get: the permission to be seen. Not seen as the scapegoat or the martyr, but seen as a flawed human whose choices were made in a terrible arithmetic of love. She took a long walk that summer with Nina and my father to a little island reserve she had visited as a child. She returned with a softness in her shoulders that seemed to say, the load was lighter now. I asked her once, as summer sloped towards fall, whether she regretted what she had done. She considered the question as if assessing the weather. I regret the times I trusted promises without insisting on a clear contract, she admitted. But I don't regret that I chose to try to keep people safe. It is a complicated shadow, love and error, cast by the same hand. We learned, as a family, to tell the story differently. Rather than the abbreviated account of Claire sacrificed for us, we began to articulate the fuller truth. Claire made choices to protect us. Those choices allowed opportunists to act. We, as a family, had to reckon with both the gift and the cost. That sentence, both the gift and the cost, became a way to hold what had happened without flattening it into a single moral headline. The final legal paperwork arrived on a cold Tuesday. The court approved the final distribution plan under the terms of the settlement, ordered an ongoing audit for a limited period, and closed the motion with a finding that there was sufficient evidence of irregular routing to justify the freeze and discovery. The court's words were carefully calibrated. They did not pronounce guilt, but they did acknowledge a pattern sufficient to intervene. That phrasing, careful, narrow, did what it was supposed to do. It made our family whole enough to continue. On the day the last check cleared, I went to Claire's house with the old cookbook. The napkin that had started all of this was folded the way it had been when I first found it. It smelled faintly of coffee still. I set it on the table between us. You started this trail, I said. You left it for someone at random, and Lena picked it up. Claire touched the napkin like one might touch a relic. I did, she said. I needed someone outside the family. I couldn't trust our habits to protect the secret in a way that would let it remain a secret if something went wrong. I chose a stranger as a safeguard. Why a napkin and not something more formal? I asked. She smiled, small and rueful. Because formal things get lawyered away immediately. A napkin is low pressure. It looks like nothing. It is domestic, and it would be ignored by the right people and found by the right person. We laughed at the strategic oddity of it, the domestic genius of hiding a map in a community cookbook.
When the conversation turned to the future, Claire surprised me again. She had, in the weeks since settlement, re-enrolled in a night course at the community college and taken to hosting a small reading group that met in her living room. She had started to date again, tentatively, with someone from the local photography club who appreciated her for public things like her knowledge of postcards and private things like her reflex to leave a secret napkin for a stranger. Is it easy? I asked once, meaning both dating and the idea of rebuilding a life beyond being the family's shield. No, she said,
But the fear that used to wedge itself between my ribs is less. I can laugh more. I can refuse to be the safe place for everything. That is a freedom I hadn't realized was a luxury. That, perhaps, was the most important after effect. Claire had reclaimed a small portion of her own life. The family had learned not to make her the sole absorbent surface for every possible shock. We started to learn boundaries, how to insulate one another with structures and conversations, rather than with one person's non-stop generosity. In the last months of the long process, I sat with Claire on the back steps, where we had once sat and whispered secrets like a form of prayer. I thought I knew what love meant, I told her one night. I thought it meant always giving until you hurt. I'm learning it can also mean being wise enough to ask for shared work. She looked at me and squeezed my hand. Love isn't one thing, she said. It's messy. It's both sacrifice and request. You can say no and still be good. I didn't know the balance. I only knew the cost of letting people fall. Now I know there are other ways. The moral thread that had begun with a greasy napkin and a stranger's conscience wound through litigation, audit rooms, and private letters to arrive at a new shape. It looked like a table where many hands could be placed, rather than one hand carrying everything. It looked like a family who told the truth without seeking to punish the wrong into infinitesimal definitions of evil. It looked like forgiveness that required naming harms and making repair. There were moments when I felt a bizarre, slow gratitude for the way the world had pushed us into honesty. Lena's courage had intersected with Elaine's integrity and Amelia's relentless preparation. Simon's patient untangling had made a visible map out of deceptive flows. Each person had been a small, risky actor in a story that could have suffocated under weight. We put a photograph of Claire on the mantel once the settlement funds covered outstanding debts, one of her at the Historical Society, handing over a donation to a community literacy program. I insisted we included Lena's name in the donor ledger anonymously, at Claire's suggestion. She deserves to be part of the good, Claire said. Quiet people who act rightly should not be erased for their humility.
One night, late and soft, I found myself reading through the folder of Claire's unsent letters again. In the margin of one she had written, "If I had to do it differently," and then nothing. It struck me as the most honest line she had offered, an acknowledgement that choosing to sacrifice can be both necessary and corrosive, that there is no perfect path out of the wilderness of moral danger, that the only viable route is to act, then repair where repair is needed. When I think back on the way the story began, an ordinary napkin tucked into a familiar book, I am struck at how often our most complicated truths hide in plain sight. The napkin taught me to look for ordinary places where extraordinary things are stored. In the pocket of a cardigan, in the bottom of a recipe box, in the waiting hands of someone who has lost faith in official institutions. People who protect us do so quietly. Sometimes they do so at a personal price that we only recognize when we're standing on a cleared field after the storm. What happened to Claire was not the neat tale of a saint. It was a human narrative stitched from fear, love, and error. She sacrificed aspects of her life to keep others safe. In doing so, she sometimes made choices that left her exposed to being used. We, her family, learned to see both her generosity and her vulnerability. We learned to build structures to avoid repeating the same error, to spread responsibility, to ask for help early, to be skeptical of arrangements that look too good when one person's balance bears the whole weight. If you ever find yourself holding a greasy napkin with a hurried note, don't be tempted to fold it back up and ignore it. Sometimes the smallest thing is the hinge of many lives. Sometimes a stranger's conscience is the only thing between your family and a slow unmaking. Claire is now learning what it means to live for herself in small increments. An art class, a weekend trip to a town she has never visited, a quiet date with someone who notices how her eyes prompt her to laugh. She is still a protector. She is just no longer the only one. I have returned to work with a different rhythm. I answer my phone more quickly when family calls. We have built a modest fund for emergencies and a ritual of checking in. The legal relief was important, but the quieter work of changing habits matters more. There is a last image I keep. Lena, wiping a table at the portside diner, tucking a napkin into her apron pocket, that pocket like a small cathedral for inconvenient mercy. She is ordinary and enormous in the way that people who act on conscience are. She risked a job and discomfort and possible retribution because she had seen harm and could not undo what had happened to her own father. Her act was the first domino. There are acts we do in secret because we fear the consequences of speaking. Some of those acts are noble, and some are naive and dangerous.
The task, once the secret is out, is to translate sacrifice into accountability without turning it into a spectacle. Claire taught me that. The law gave us means to recover what was necessary. The people who stepped forward, Lena, Elaine, Amelia, Simon, gave us a chance. Months after the settlement closed, Claire and I sat on the porch and watched the first snow of the season. It came down the way secrets sometimes do, slow enough to notice, soft enough to cover everything with a new surface. She reached for my hand. "You can tell people the whole story now," she said. "Not so they can judge me, but so they can see that help sometimes arrives from odd places. Tell them I did it because I was afraid of what would happen if no one stepped in." I nodded. "I will tell them," I said. "I'll tell them the napkin story, and Lena's risk, and Amelia's steady hands, and your quiet courage. I'll tell them that protection can be a heavy thing, and that it shouldn't be left for one person to carry." She smiled, a little relieved. "Tell them too," she said, "that saving people sometimes means learning to be saved." If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who has quietly kept things together, stay connected. There are more stories of ordinary bravery I want to share, and if you subscribe, you'll hear them. And please, if you know someone who has been quietly protecting others, reach out to them, say thank you, offer help. Sometimes the best way to honor a sacrifice is to make sure it doesn't have to be repeated.